Welcome to Cozy Mystery Stories, where secrets and suspense are the most intriguing of guests. Our tale begins within the ancient, stone-cold walls of Blackwood Castle, a Gothic marvel perched on a remote Scottish isle. For one night only, its host, the enigmatic Lord Alastair Blackwood, has revived a forgotten tradition, a Halloween masquerade ball. As a tempestuous autumn storm brews, isolating the castle completely, masked guests arrive, each concealing far more than just their face. Chapter 1. There is a certain theatricality to a Scottish storm, my dear reader, a performance of wind and water that feels as ancient as the stones it batters. On this particular Halloween evening, the performance was reaching its grand crescendo. The wind howled around the turrets of Blackwood Castle like a chorus of aggrieved spirits, and the sea, a churning cauldron of grey and black, had already swallowed the narrow causeway that tethered the island to the mainland. We were, in every sense of the word, trapped, an amusing little predicament if one were not in the company of strangers with secrets, and what a company it was. I, Elena Vance, a spinster of what is politely termed a certain age, found myself observing the assembly from a shadowed alcove in the great hall. One must always find a quiet corner from which to watch the play unfold. It is where the most interesting details reveal themselves. Our host, Lord Alastair Blackwood, drifted through his guests like a ghost at his own feast. He wore the mask of a magnificent stag, yet his eyes, visible through the ornate cutouts, held the skittish terror of a hunted animal. He was a man drowning in history, and the water, I suspected, was rising fast. His wife, the much younger and impossibly beautiful Lady Beatrice, was his perfect opposite. Masked as a silver fox, she was all sleek confidence and predatory grace. Her laughter, a tinkling sound like ice in a crystal glass, seemed to mock the very stones of the castle her husband so clearly worshipped. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much, yet revealed far too little. Then there was the American Mr. Sealer's Croft. One could hardly miss him. Large, loud, and dressed in a rather tasteless bull costume, he seemed to take a perverse pleasure in lowering the tone. He was an industrialist, I had gathered, with a wallet as thick as his accent and manners as subtle as a foghorn. He was here to discuss some business with Lord Alastair, a fact he announced with the delicacy of a cannon blast, and was already holding court, boasting of a recent corporate conquest. Ruined him, utterly and completely, he boomed, slapping his thigh. Man didn't know what hit him. You have to be ruthless in this world or you get eaten alive. His words seemed to catch in the air, hanging there for a moment too long. I saw Major Colin Fletcher, a bulldog of a man in both mask and bearing, stiffen almost imperceptibly. The Major was a man of ramrod posture and a clipped moustache, a relic of an empire that no longer existed. He watched the American with a quiet, burning intensity that was far more menacing than Mr. Croft's boisterous threats. Not far from them hovered the young poet, Mr. Julian Finch, looking utterly lost in his mask of a sorrowful hero. He was a delicate, bird-like creature, all nerves and trembling hands, and he flinched at every one of Mr. Croft's guffaws as if from a physical blow. He clutched a slim volume of his own verse as if it were a shield. Flitting between groups with the preening vanity of her peacock mask was Mademoiselle Isabelle Dubois, a French actress whose fame, I understood, was more pronounced on the continent. She was a friend of Lady Beatrice, and the two of them, the fox and the peacock, made a striking pair, whispering secrets behind their fans. And then, observing all, was Dr. Aris Thorne. His costume was, perhaps, the most unsettling of all, the long, beaked mask and dark robes of a plague doctor. He was a psychiatrist, a student of the mind's darker corridors, and he watched the proceedings with a detached, clinical amusement that I found rather disquieting. It was as if he were not a guest at a party, but a scientist observing specimens in a jar. The castle itself was a character in our little drama. It was a labyrinth of draughty corridors, groaning timbers, and portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow one's every move. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp stone, and something else, anticipation. Lord Alastair had arranged a bit of after-dinner entertainment, a game of hide-and-seek throughout the castle's ground floor. A silly tradition, he'd announced, his voice thin and strained, but one my grandfather insisted upon. As the ancient grandfather clock in the hall began its wheezing chime for 10, the lights flickered violently and died, plunging us into absolute darkness. A few women shrieked, a nervous laugh echoed in the void, and then Lord Alastair's voice, closer than I expected, called out, "A power outage. Not to worry, the generator should kick in shortly. In the meantime, let the game begin." The darkness was suddenly alive with the rustle of silk, the soft tread of feet, and muffled giggles. It was all very childish, and yet the oppressive atmosphere of the castle lent it a sinister edge. I, having no desire to be stumbled upon in the dark, remained in my alcove. One learns more by staying still. The minutes stretched into an eternity of blackness and silence, punctuated by the raging of the storm outside. Then finally the generator rumbled to life. The sconces on the walls flickered, casting long, dancing shadows, and then settled into a steady, golden glow. The guests began to emerge from their hiding places, laughing and blinking in the sudden light. All but one. It was the young poet, Julian Finch, who found him. A scream, thin and terrified, echoed from the library. We rushed in to find Mr. Finch, his Pierrot mask askew, pointing a trembling finger. There, sprawled inelegantly on a priceless Persian rug, lay the bull. Mr. Sealer's Croft was quite, entirely and unmistakably dead. His mask had been removed and lay beside his head, its painted eyes seeming to stare in surprise. Around his neck, the gaudy frills of his costume were slightly askew, but there were no obvious signs of violence. It was all very neat. Too neat. Ah, but my dear reader, the most dangerous poisons are often the quietest. Chapter 2. Panic, I have observed, is a remarkably unhelpful emotion. It spreads through a crowd like a contagion, stripping away logic and leaving only raw, sputtering fear. The library, which moments before had been a sanctuary of leather-bound knowledge, was now a theatre of hysteria. Mademoiselle Dubois fainted gracefully into the arms of a startled Major Fletcher. Lady Beatrice pressed a hand to her mouth with a gasp that seemed just a little too perfectly timed, and Lord Alastair simply stared, his face the colour of bee. Leached parchment, it was Dr. Thorne, the plague doctor, who brought a measure of calm. He knelt beside the body with a professional detachment that was both reassuring and chilling. "Everyone, stay back," he commanded, his voice sharp. "Do not touch anything." He leaned closer to Mr. Croft's face, his own beaked mask a grotesque parody of a bird of prey studying its kill. He sniffed delicately at the victim's slightly parted lips. "I may be mistaken," he murmured, more to himself than to us, "but I believe I detect the faint aroma of bitter almonds. Cyanide." The word hung in the air, unspoken but understood. A poisoner, here among us. The realization settled upon the guests like a shroud, turning suspicion into a palpable living thing. We were trapped on this godforsaken island with a murderer. "The telephone," Lord Alastair stammered, finally finding his voice. "MacLeod, check the telephone." The butler, a grim, stoic man who seemed carved from the very granite of the castle, bowed his head and departed, his face an unreadable mask of its own. He returned moments later. "The line is dead, my lord, the storm, I imagine." Of course it was. The murderer had not needed to cut the line. Nature, in its infinite capacity for dramatic timing, had done it for them. We were utterly alone. In the ensuing chaos, it was Miss Elena Vance who began to think. One must always consider the little grey cells, for they are the only tools that can cut through the fog of fear. I noticed 3 things in those first few minutes, 3 little details that seemed out of place. First, on the floor near Mr. Croft's outstretched hand, almost hidden in the deep pile of the rug, was a single, iridescent blue-green feather. It was, I was quite certain, from a peacock. Second, as Dr. Thorne had pointed out, the death was clean, almost clinical, suggesting a poison administered with terrifying precision. And third, the victim's right-hand jacket pocket was slightly turned out, as if something had been hastily removed, or perhaps placed within it. While Dr. Thorne pronounced that nothing more could be done for the poor man, I saw my chance. With the others distracted by their own mounting terror, I knelt, pretending to adjust the buckle on my shoe, and my fingers brushed against that pocket. They closed around a small, folded piece of paper. With a swiftness that would have surprised my fellow guests, had they been watching, I slipped it into my reticule. A clue, I felt certain, must not be left to the clumsy hands of a panic-stricken mob. "We must all convene in the drawing-room," Major Fletcher announced, taking charge with military briskness. His voice cut through the noise, and people, desperate for direction, obeyed. "We are all in this together. We must be logical. We must ascertain where everyone was during the game." The drawing-room was a grand, cold space, dominated by a vast fireplace where a pathetic fire sputtered against the encroaching chill. We sat, a collection of masked suspects, eyeing each other over the rims of sherry glasses that MacLeod had dispensed with a steady hand. The interrogation, for that is what it was, began. "I was with Dr. Thorne," Lady Beatrice declared, her voice trembling prettily. "We hid together behind the tapestries in the west corridor. We never separated." Dr. Thorne inclined his head. "That is correct." Lady Beatrice was feeling a trifle faint. We were discussing the psychological pressures of such an antiquated environment. His explanation was smooth, plausible, and yet it felt rehearsed. Mademoiselle Dubois, now revived and dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, was next. "I hid in the conservatory," she whispered. "It was so dark, so frightening. I heard footsteps, but I saw no one." I glanced at her peacock mask. As I suspected, a single feather was missing from its magnificent plume. The Major himself claimed to have hidden in the study, right next to the library. "Heard a scuffle, I thought," he said, his brow furrowed. "But with this wind, it's hard to be certain." Sounded like a book falling. Lord Alastair had sequestered himself in the dining hall, while young Mr. Finch admitted with a shudder to cowering in a suit of armour in the main hall. "I saw a shadow move towards the library just before the lights came back on," he added, his voice barely audible. "A tall, slender shadow." He glanced nervously towards Dr. Thorne. It was all so very convenient. Alibis built on darkness and shared fear, accusations as flimsy as cobwebs. One must look past what is said to what is not. I thought of the folded paper in my reticule. Excusing myself for a moment, I retreated to a quiet corner and unfolded it. The handwriting was spiky and agitated. The message was short and cryptic. "The raven calls for what was taken. The raven." I looked up at the grand stone mantelpiece. Carved into it was the Blackwood family crest, a raven, wings outstretched, clutching a tarnished silver key. The note was not a threat delivered to Croft, but a statement of intent. The Blackwood raven was calling in a debt. I looked across at Lord Alastair, who was staring into the fire, his stag mask now removed, his face a portrait of utter despair. The motive, it seemed, was beginning to take shape. Mr. Croft, the boorish American, had not come merely to visit. He had come to collect. Chapter 3. The night bled into a grey, weeping dawn. Sleep had been a stranger to us all. We'd passed the hours in the drawing-room, a silent, nerve-shredded vigil, starting at every creak of the ancient house. The storm had not abated, and the castle felt less like a home and more like a tomb. With the first watery light of morning, a new sense of purpose, grim though it was, settled over the group. We were the investigators now, the jury, and one of us the executioner. It was agreed, at the Major's insistence, that we should search Mr. Croft's guest room. Perhaps a motive, a clue to his dealings with Lord Alastair, could be found there. Lord Alastair protested weakly, calling it an invasion of privacy, but he was swiftly overruled. His objections, I noted, seemed rooted more in exhaustion than in any real principle. We proceeded upstairs in a grim procession. Mr. Croft's room was opulent and impersonal, save for a large leather briefcase that sat on the desk. It was locked. We must open it, the Major declared. Without a key, that is impossible, said Dr. Thorne, a hint of a smirk in his tone. It was then that young Mr. Finch spoke up, his voice quavering. I used to pick locks. A foolish hobby from my youth. All eyes turned to the poet. It was a most unexpected revelation. With a few trembling moments of work using a hairpin supplied by Mademoiselle Dubois, the lock clicked open. Inside was a sheaf of legal documents. As Lord Alastair had feared, they pertained to the Blackwood estate. Mr. Croft had not been a potential partner, he had been a predator. He held the deeds to several of Lord Alastair's disastrous investments. The castle, the last vestige of the Blackwood legacy, was the final collateral. Croft had come here this weekend to finalise the foreclosure. He was going to take everything. The motive was now laid bare for all to see, shining and ugly. Lord Alastair Blackwood, a proud man of ancient lineage, was facing utter ruin. Would he not kill to prevent it, to protect the home that was so deeply entwined with his identity? He sank into a chair, his face in his hands, offering no defence. The raven had called for what was being taken from him. But dear reader, the truth is often hidden in plain sight, disguised as the most obvious solution. While the others focused on our host, my mind was on the other little inconsistencies. The peacock feather, the slender shadow. I decided to pay a visit to Mademoiselle Dubois. I found her in her room, reposing on a chaise longue. She was a picture of tragic beauty, but her eyes were sharp and watchful. That feather, I began gently, the one I found in the library. It came from your mask, did it not? She waved a dismissive hand. It must have fallen while I was dancing earlier, a trifle. A trifle found beside a dead man, I pressed. You said you were in the conservatory. Did you see anyone, hear anything other than footsteps? Her composure cracked for just a fraction of a second, a flicker of fear in her eyes. No. Nothing, it was dark, I saw nothing. But she was lying. Her denial was too swift, too absolute. My next port of call was the library itself. The body of Mr. Croft had been moved to a cold storage room, but the scene of the crime remained. I examined the rug again, more closely this time. And there, near where the victim's head had lain, I saw it. A tiny, dark smear on the deep crimson wool. I touched it cautiously. It was slightly sticky. Ink. Not from a pen, but perhaps from a printing press. It reminded me of the ink on Julian Finch's fingers. The pieces were beginning to swim into a new configuration in my mind. Lord Alastair had the motive of a desperate man. Mademoiselle Dubois was lying. But what of the others? The Major had a motive of old-world revenge, for Croft had, by his own admission, ruined his father. Mr. Finch, the timid poet, had flinched every time Croft spoke. Had the American brute ruined him too? And Dr. Thorne, the cool observer, what secrets lay behind that clinical facade? He seemed to enjoy the chaos, to relish the psychological drama of it all. Later that afternoon, a new terror befell us. The storm was at its peak when a scream echoed from the upper floor. It was Mademoiselle Dubois. We found her in the corridor, pointing a shaking hand at her door. It had been forced open, the lock splintered. Her room was in disarray, her belongings tossed about as if by a madman. "My jewels," she cried. "They are gone." But it was not a simple robbery. On her vanity mirror, scrawled in lipstick, was another message, a single chilling word. Liar. The attack was personal. Someone knew she had not been telling the truth about her whereabouts in the conservatory. And they wanted to frighten her, or perhaps to silence her permanently. The atmosphere in the castle grew heavier, more poisonous. The killer was not finished. They were playing with us, turning us against one another, enjoying the slow, delicious unraveling of our civility. We were no longer guests at a party. We were rats in a very elegant, very deadly trap. Chapter 4. The second incident, the ransacking of Mademoiselle Dubois' room, achieved its desired effect. Paranoia, once a creeping vine, now had us all firmly in its grip. We retreated into ourselves, conversations dwindling to suspicious whispers. Every shadow in the long corridors seemed to hold a threat. Every creak of the floorboards was a footstep of doom. Major Fletcher attempted to organize watches. but the effort collapsed into bickering. No one trusted anyone else enough to turn their back. It was in this atmosphere of escalating dread that I decided to pursue the small matter of the ink smear. I sought out Mr. Julian Finch, finding him in a small, dusty alcove of the library, the very book of his own poems clutched in his white-knuckled hands. "Mr. Finch," I began, my voice softer than I intended. He jumped, a startled bird. "Your poetry, is it your only source of income?" The question seemed to wound him. A dark blush crept up his pale neck. "It is my life," he said stiffly. "But it does not pay the bills, does it?" I continued gently. Mr. Croft, his business dealings were not limited to titled gentlemen like our host. He dabbled in publishing, did he not? He acquired a small, independent press about a year ago. A press that had just signed a promising young poet to a rather generous contract, only to see that contract voided and the poet's inheritance, which was tied up in the company, vanish into Mr. Croft's portfolio. Julian Finch stared at me, his sorrowful Pierrot mask forgotten in his room, his face a naked portrait of anguish and fury. "He destroyed me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He called my work unmarketable drivel and used a loophole to take everything my father had left me. He was a monster. Another motive as powerful and as raw as any of the others. The ink on the floor was from his book, I surmised. Perhaps he had dropped it during a confrontation. And the slender shadow he claimed to have seen. But how easy it is to describe oneself. While the others saw a web with Lord Alastair at its centre, I saw the threads of a different pattern entirely. 3 people, the Major, Lord Alastair and Mr. Finch, had all been financially ruined or grievously wronged by Sealer's Croft. A 4th, Mademoiselle Dubois, was clearly hiding something she had witnessed. And a 5th, Dr. Thorne, watched it all with a disturbing relish. Only one person seemed to float above the fray, Lady Beatrice, the grieving widow. She played the part to perfection, accepting condolences with a fragile grace, her silver fox mask now a symbol of cunning sorrow. Yet I recalled her flirtatious whispers with Dr. Thorne, her cool, appraising glances at her husband's distress. She did not seem like a woman whose world had just collapsed. She seemed like a woman whose plans were proceeding on schedule. My mind kept returning to the poison. Cyanide is not a substance one simply has to hand. It requires foresight, knowledge. My thoughts drifted to Dr. Thorne. A medical man, a student of the mind's poisons. Could he not also be a student of the body? It was a flimsy connection, but in this house of secrets, flimsy connections were all one had. I found him in the study, calmly reading a leather-bound volume. His plague doctor mask sat on the table beside him, its vacant eyes unnervingly lifelike. "Doctor," I said, "you seem remarkably untroubled by our situation." He looked up, a thin smile playing on his lips. "On the contrary, Miss Vance, I am fascinated. It is a perfect psychological experiment. Strip away the thin veneer of civilization, introduce a catalyst, in this case murder, and observe the raw elemental passions that emerge. Fear, greed, revenge, they are all on display." "Including your own passions, perhaps?" I asked coolly, his smile widened. "My only passion is for understanding. The killer, for instance, note the theatricality. A masquerade ball, a game of hide-and-seek, a subtle poison. This is not a crime of passion. This is a performance. Our killer is an artist of a sort." His words were meant to chill, and they did, but they also illuminated. An artist, a performer. Like an actress, perhaps, or someone directing a play of their own devising. The day wore on, each hour stretching into an eon. The final pieces I needed were not in the house, but in the mind of the killer. I had the what and the how, but the who was still obscured by a veil of clever misdirection. One must always look for the person who benefits the most, not just financially, but emotionally. Who in this tangled mess had the most to gain? As dusk began to settle, casting the castle once more into a realm of deep shadows and flickering light, I knew the time had come. The performance was nearing its final act. It was time to gather the players and raise the curtain. Chapter 5. If I could have everyone's attention, I announced, my voice carrying through the cavernous drawing room with more authority than I felt. I believe I know what happened to Mr. Croft. A collective intake of breath. The faces turned towards me, a gallery of fear, disbelief, and suspicion. Lord Alastair looked up with weary resignation, the Major with stern curiosity, and Dr. Thorne with the keen interest of a spectator awaiting the grand finale. I had them, all of them. We have been led to believe, I began, pacing slowly before the fireplace, that this was a crime born of desperation. We uncovered a powerful motive for Lord Alastair. His ancestral home was threatened, his legacy on the verge of extinction. The note found in the victim's pocket, the raven calls for what was taken, points directly to the Blackwood family crest. A simple, compelling case. I paused, letting my words hang in the air. We also learned that Major Fletcher bore a deep and long-standing grudge against Mr. Croft, who was responsible for his father's ruin and subsequent suicide. A crime of honour, perhaps, and Mr. Finch, our sensitive poet, was also a victim of Mr. Croft's predatory business practices, robbed of his inheritance and his career. 3 powerful motives, 3 likely suspects. I turned my gaze to Mademoiselle Dubois, and we have a witness who lied. Mademoiselle, you were not cowering in the conservatory. You were in the west corridor and you saw something, did you not? You saw the killer. That is why your room was ransacked and the word liar was scrawled on your mirror. It was a warning to keep silent. The actress paled, twisting her handkerchief. I saw a shadow near the library door. It was a woman's silhouette. Her eyes darted towards Lady Beatrice, the silver fox. She sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable. A woman, I repeated. That would seem to implicate Lady Beatrice. Or perhaps Mademoiselle Dubois herself. But the feather, you see, was a piece of theatre, too obvious. A prop, left on stage to draw the audience's eye. Just as the ransacking of the room was a piece of misdirection, designed to cast Mademoiselle as a victim and lend false credence to her coerced testimony. I let that sink in before delivering the first conclusion. The murder of Silas Croft was not a single act, it was a conspiracy, a plot for revenge conceived by the 3 men he had wronged. I pointed a finger at the poet. You, Mr. Finch, you pennied the note. The handwriting, so spiky and agitated, was a clever imitation of your own poetic scrawl. You placed it in his pocket during the game. Then to the Major. You, Major Fletcher, procured the poison, through old military contacts, perhaps. A small quantity of cyanide, odorless and tasteless when administered correctly. And finally, to the host. And you, Lord Alastair, you orchestrated the opportunity. The party, the game in the dark, the convenient power failure which you, knowing the castle's ancient wiring, could easily have engineered. You all wanted him dead. You worked together to ensure it happened. A stunned silence fell over the room. Lord Alastair buried his face in his hands with a choked sob. The Major stood ramrod straight, his face grim but devoid of denial. Julian Finch simply wept. It was a confession in triplicate. The case, it seemed, was closed. But one must never be satisfied with the first solution, no matter how tidy. For the little grey cells whisper that human nature is rarely so straightforward. A brilliant performance, Dr. Thorne murmured, a slow, appreciative clap echoing in the silent room. A truly fascinating confluence of vengeful minds. Almost perfect, I agreed, turning to face him. But a performance requires a director. One who understands the actors, who knows their weaknesses, their motivations, and who can manipulate them to serve the grand design. These 3 men, consumed by their individual hatred, would never have thought to collaborate. They needed a catalyst. Someone to bring them together, to plant the seed of the idea, to whisper in their ears and orchestrate the entire affair. I walked towards the centre of the room, my gaze falling upon the one person who had remained silent, an island of calm in a sea of turmoil. This crime was not about saving a castle or avenging a father or reclaiming an inheritance. It was about something much older, much deeper. It was about a fourth victim of Sealer's Croft, a man whose ruin was so complete that his name has been all but forgotten. A business partner betrayed not only by Croft, but by his other partner as well, Major Fletcher's father. The Major's head snapped up, his face a mask of confusion. This partner had a daughter, I continued, my voice dropping. A young girl who watched her family destroyed, her father descend into poverty and despair. A girl who grew up with a singular burning purpose, to exact revenge on all who had wronged her. She was clever, patient, and utterly ruthless. She changed her name, reinvented herself, and set her plan in motion. A plan that required her to get close to power, to find a man she could control. A weak, desperate man like Lord Alastair Blackwood. I stopped directly in front of his wife. "Isn't that right, Lady Beatrice?" The mask of the grieving widow fell away, replaced by a look of cold, triumphant fury. Her beauty was terrible, chilling. "He was a pig," she said, her voice low and venomous. "All of them were. Croft, the old Major, my foolish husband. They take and they leave broken lives in their wake. Did they deserve to live? My father was a good man. They destroyed him. I simply balanced the scales. It was all there. She had sought out and married the vulnerable Lord Alastair. She had discovered the grudges held by the Major and the poet, and subtly woven them into her plot, manipulating them into becoming her unwitting accomplices. She provided the true impetus, the poison, likely acquired through Dr. Thorne, whom she had charmed and manipulated with her fascinating psychological profile, and the cold-blooded resolve. She handed Croft the poisoned glass herself during the toast, a final, intimate act of vengeance disguised as hospitality. She had orchestrated everything, every last detail, a masterpiece of malice. At that moment, as if on cue, a sound cut through the howling of the wind, the distant, unmistakable rumble of an engine. The storm was breaking. The boat from the mainland was coming. Rescue was at hand. Lady Beatrice smiled, a slow, chilling curve of her lips. "It seems the play is over," she said, her voice devoid of remorse. I looked at the collection of broken people around me. The manipulated husband, the vengeful son, the ruined artist, all puppets in her grand design. Then I looked at the woman who had pulled their strings. There was no justice here, only the devastating aftermath of a poison that had been brewing for decades. Outside, the world was returning, but inside the ancient walls of Blackwood Castle, the ghosts of the past would linger forever, a testament to the darkness that can hide behind the most beautiful and cunning of masks.